Hi, everyone. I've posted one demo annotation of the birthmark, and I'd done this for an earlier class. And I was looking at it and thinking, if I were actually doing this for an essay that I were writing on the birthmark, I would dig in a lot deeper than I do in that annotation. I've got a couple of things circled and highlighted, notes made, and yet I don't really dig that much into individual words and phrases except as places where I know that I might want to research more to look things up. And so I wanted to do a second video for you, another kind of a ride along while I annotate a passage from The Little Mermaid. And it's not necessarily the most exciting passage, but that's okay. There are plenty of other ones for you to choose, but it's also a passage that I really wanted to make sure that you looked at. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that we can do that. So there are a lot of passages in Little Mermaid that are really worth looking at. Many of them are much more visually interesting than this one, but this is one I wanted you to pay attention to. And so looking at this, it's a little discussion I want you to pay attention to, and it's always kind of a good idea to reread something uh, various times, maybe after you've annotated it, before you've annotated it. You'll discover all kinds of things about it that you might not necessarily discover just running your eyes over it or even listening to someone else read it. So, well, if I were annotating this just normally, I wouldn't read it out loud to myself. Before I did that, I'd just annotate as I was reading, but I will read it out loud just to make us all feel anchored to the passage once again. And so this is sort of, I don't know, a third of the way through. If human beings are not drowned, asked the little mermaid, can they live forever? Do they never die as we do here in the sea? Yes, replied the old lady, they must also die, and their term of life is even shorter than ours. We sometimes live to 300 years, but when we cease to exist here, we only become the foam on the surface of the water, and we have not even a grave down here of those we love. We have not immortal souls. We shall never live again. But like the green seaweed, once it has been cut off, we can never flourish more. Human beings, on the contrary, have a soul which lives forever, lives after the body has been turned to dust. It rises up through the clear, pure air beyond the glittering stars. As we rise out of the water and behold all the land of the earth, so do they rise to unknown and glorious regions which we shall never see. Why have not we an immortal soul? Asked the little mermaid mournfully. I would give gladly all the hundreds of years that I have to live to be a human being only for one day, and to have the hope of knowing the happiness of that glorious world above the stars. You must not think of that, said the old woman. We feel ourselves to be much happier and much better off than human beings. So I shall die, said the little mermaid, and as the foam of the sea, I shall be driven about, never again to hear the music of the waves, or to see the pretty flowers, nor the red sun. Is there anything I can do to win an immortal soul? And I'll stop there because, it's important for you to remember that the motivation in the story for her transformation, for her willing, what we could call self-mutilation, well, her changes in her body and giving up the thing that she values the most, her voice. Well, those are all sort of motivated initially, even though they're kind of wrapped up together, by this desire for an immortal soul, not by the desire for the prince. And so, as I say, they are kind of wrapped up in each other, but it's very interesting to track the two things and see how one or the other emerges as the most important thread in her longing to be human. But let's just talk about this passage for a minute. And so I think this is a really interesting passage just because it sets up some key things for the story and key things in terms of what the ontology is of mermaids and humans as Andersen describes them. So, what the nature of their being is, both in life and in afterlife. What I think is even more interesting, though, is the ways in which the explanation and the wording of the explanation, the flow of the language, in a way counteracts some of the messages that the grandmother is trying to give her granddaughter. And so to speak specifically about that, let's just look at her explanation of the relative situations of humans and mermaids. So mermaids, okay, so humans must also die, and their term of life is even shorter than ours. We sometimes live to 300 years. So there's a sort of a beginning that really focuses on what mermaids have and mermen have, merfolk have that humans don't have. Then there's a little bit of a turn. But when we cease to exist here, we only become the foam on the surface of the water. And we have not even a grave down here of those we love. So the first part of the sentence seems to be focusing on what's really great about being merfolk. And the second part of the sentence talks about the limitations and what they don't have. In fact, there's a repetition of those negatives. We only become this, we have not even that. And it keeps going. We have not immortal souls. We shall never live again. So there's a repetition of negatives. And so I might just make myself a note of that. And then as the sentence goes on, there's a simile, like the green seaweed, when once a comparison using like or as, like the green seaweed, but it's also really set up just as an analogy. Like the green seaweed, once it has been cut off, we can never flourish more. So what I think is interesting about that is, what is the comparison? So they're being compared to vegetation in a sense, to plant life. And I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is a story in which plant life in various forms is celebrated, and it's part of the rich and lush visual descriptions in this story. So you wouldn't necessarily think that being compared to vegetation is a bad thing. But on the other hand, it sort of makes me want to stop and ask about that. I think when you have these comparisons, when you have things that seem to you to create messages that in other contexts would be negative in some way, you have to always look at them locally. So the most important place to interpret an image or a symbol is within the story in which it occurs, because that's where it has its most important meaning. So don't always assume that what red means elsewhere is going to mean the same thing here, because it's probably not, especially if somebody's doing something interesting. Human beings, on the contrary, so we're going back to humans now, have a soul. So we're going to positives now, things that attributes as opposed to things that we don't have. Human beings have a soul which lives forever, lives after the body has been turned to dust. So there's a repetition, lives forever, lives after the body has been turned to dust. It rises up through the clear, pure air beyond the glittering stars. So that's a really lovely phrase. We've got repetition there. And here we have what I will call lyricism. It's very poetic. It's like, it's like song lyrics. It's got this beautiful, beautiful presentation of not just that human beings have a soul that rises up, but she's providing detail on that rising up so that we can imagine it and imagine it in really beautiful ways. Clear, pure air beyond the glittering stars. And so they're having this conversation underwater. This is so many layers, so many realms above. And she's inviting us to move up there with them as we rise out of the water. So analogy comes in again. And so this is not a simile exactly. This is analogy comparing, so the way that humans being rise up after they have died and their immortal souls rise up to the realm above the stars. It's like when we rise up out of the water. So she's trying to explain it to her granddaughter. But interestingly, they're rising up out of the water, beholding the land of the earth. So do they rise to unknown and glorious regions, which we shall never see. The comparison here really makes mer people seem a lot less limited in their capacities. And of course, she's describing the things that they do now while they're alive to the things that the immortal soul do after death. But still, there's a really big gap there between the merfolk and the human soul that we become more aware of because of parallelism. So there's a parallel structure in the sentence. As we rise, so do they rise, and a parallel between there's what happens and in that rising in these two realms that folks move to. Just another thing that I would say is interesting, and there's certainly others that I'm not noticing. This is just me, but the idea, sort of when the Little Mermaid says, "I want that," what she wants is to have the hope of knowing the happiness of that glorious world above the stars. So what she's talking about here is an imagined experience of what's not named, but what we could think about maybe as heaven. So the afterlife. So that's what she's thinking of, the happiness of that glorious world above the stars. The old woman says, her grandmother says, forget it, we think of ourselves as much happier. If we think back to the previous paragraph, however, we might not necessarily feel that she's made that great a case for the greater happiness of merfolk over humans, simply through the way that she describes their comparative futures and the fates that they have waiting for them after death. One last bit. So I shall die, and as the foam of the sea, I shall be driven about, never again to hear the music of the waves or to see the pretty flowers of the red sun. So she's no longer thinking about that glorious world above the stars, is she? She's thinking about the sensory delights of being here in the moment in the world. And so it tells us not only something about what she finds valuable in the world, and this is after she's had this great experience of exploring the world above the water, and certainly in saving the prince's life, and being fascinated by him, and being just full of desire for him. But she's really interested in that world. And this is what sort of emerges, not the idea of her vision of heaven. So when she talks about the loss that's involved here in not being human, it's interesting that it's not the loss, even this early on, it is not necessarily the loss of that celestial world above the stars that she feels the loss of, but rather the presence of the moment. And so it's kind of interesting, just the different currents that are taking place in here in terms of how the immortal soul is envisioned, how its futures are envisioned, how human possibilities and merfolk possibilities are envisioned, and also just the nature of the character of the Little Mermaid and how we learn more about where she's coming from. She's a young person. She's got mixed feelings, and her imagination is based on what she can actually see and touch and hear now. One of the last things that I want to say here, and I'm going to get away from this markup. I'm just going to add, see, I'm not adding all my notes here, but thinks of loss in terms of now, not afterlife. I think the really fascinating thing to me about this story is that there is so much lush visual description, and there's auditory description as well. One of the things that she hears the church bells ringing multiple times from underwater, and that whole question of what things sound like underwater is something that Andersen explores. But unless I was just a careless reader the last time I read it, which is certainly possible, there's not so much of what I would think would be really distinctive if you were living underwater for most of your life, and that would be the sense of smell. And so I'm really making a point of going back and looking for that to see if that's part of his sensory world, because it's very, very visual, it's very auditory. It's tactile as well, although thank goodness not tactile continually, given the level of suffering that she goes through. But it's always interesting to see what kind of world is created in terms of the senses. And this is not the most vivid paragraph or a set of paragraphs in terms of the sensory details. There are lots more that are very, very vivid, including, if we want to just look down just for a little bit, amazing passage on the polyps. And so if you've seen the movie, you know that that's a really compelling moment in the animated movie. It's also a really compelling moment in the story itself. And this is a great passage to analyze and to do a close reading of if later on, do an annotation of it now if you are looking for something in this story to annotate. But I think there are a lot of good choices. It is, no pun intended, like shooting fish in a barrel. Okay, that's it for this ride along, and I hope that this is helpful to you. I would also invite you To absolutely, if you would like to have more help with this and you'd like to, come to my drop-in office hours or make an appointment and just go through a passage together and talk about things that we might do with annotation, absolutely, just let me know. One of the things that people have mentioned in their great advice about keeping the mind from wandering is that annotating really does keep you focused on the page. And I think that it really does it if you are working with something in your hands to do that. So I would encourage you to do that. I did not retype this passage. Again, I think that's a great step to take as well, because if you retype it, you will really learn how the sentence or how the paragraph works word by word, as if you were walking in somebody else's footsteps. So these are all great things for analysis. They're also great things for creative writers, if any of you out there